In January 1942, high above the Pacific, the air is thin and painfully still. Inside the cockpit of a Mitsubishi Zero, a Japanese naval aviator stares at an empty sky. The engine hum is constant, almost soothing, but it does nothing to quiet the tension tightening in his chest. Below him, endless water. Ahead, nothing but pale blue haze and sunlight reflecting off the canopy glass. There is no enemy in sight. That is what makes the waiting unbearable. His hands rest lightly on the controls. Fuel gauges are checked again. Oxygen flow steady. The radio remains silent. Training has taught him precision, discipline, and obedience. It has not taught him how long silence can last before fear begins to creep in. Every pilot in the formation knows what they are waiting for: the first hit. The first burst of tracer fire tearing through the air. The first moment when American aircraft finally appear and the war becomes real in the sky. Until then, there is only anticipation and the unspoken knowledge that once the waiting ends, nothing will ever be the same again. That moment of suspended fear did not come from nowhere. It was shaped by the world Japan had entered, and the war it believed it already understood. By the time Japanese pilots found themselves circling over open ocean, waiting for the first sign of resistance, the Pacific War had already been decided in Tokyo, at least on paper. In December 1941, Imperial Japan entered the war with a doctrine built on speed, shock, and aerial dominance. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not meant to begin a long conflict. It was designed to paralyze the United States long enough for Japan to secure a defensive perimeter stretching from the Central Pacific to Southeast Asia. Air power was the spearhead of that plan. Japanese naval aviation was, in 1941, among the most experienced in the world. For years, its pilots had trained relentlessly, often flying hundreds of hours before ever seeing combat. They practiced long-range navigation over featureless water, carrier landings under difficult conditions, and coordinated strikes involving fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo aircraft operating as a single organism. At the center of this system was the Mitsubishi Zero. Lightweight, extraordinarily maneuverable, and possessing a range unmatched by any contemporary fighter, the Zero gave Japanese pilots confidence bordering on certainty. Early encounters with Chinese, British, and American aircraft reinforced that belief. Opponents were often slower, less agile, and poorly coordinated. Many were shot down before they could even react. Japanese air doctrine emphasized offense above all else. Pilots were taught to seek the enemy, close aggressively, and destroy them before they could organize a defense. Protection, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks was sacrificed to gain range and maneuverability. Survival was assumed to come from skill, not equipment. This philosophy shaped the mindset of the men climbing into cockpits in late 1941 and early 1942. They believed the sky belonged to them. More importantly, they believed that fear itself could be overcome through discipline and repetition. Personal doubt was something to be mastered, not discussed. Yet beneath this confidence lay structural weaknesses. Japan's elite pilots were the product of an unforgiving training pipeline that took years to complete. Losses could not be easily replaced. Each veteran aviator represented irreplaceable experience, but this reality was rarely acknowledged openly. As Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, early success masked these vulnerabilities. American air units were caught on the ground. Radar networks were incomplete. Command structures were fragmented. For Japanese pilots, many missions felt almost routine, and that routine created a dangerous expectation that the enemy would always be slow to respond, always disorganized, always late. But wars do not remain static, and far from the cockpits of the Zero, the enemy was watching, measuring, and learning, quietly preparing for the moment when waiting in the sky would no longer be one-sided. While Japanese aviators flew with confidence across newly conquered skies, the balance of the air war was already beginning to shift, not through dramatic victories, but through adaptation. In early 1942, American commanders understood a hard truth. They could not match Japanese experience pilot for pilot, or aircraft for aircraft, in close-range maneuvering combat. Early losses had been severe. But defeat brought clarity. Survival depended on changing how the war in the air was fought. One of the most important changes was invisible from the cockpit: radar. Across the Pacific, Allied forces expanded early warning networks, linking ground stations with fighter control centers. For the first time, Japanese pilots would face an enemy that could see them coming long before they saw the enemy. This altered the rhythm of flight. American fighters were no longer scrambling blindly after bombs had already fallen. They were climbing to altitude, forming formations, and positioning themselves between Japanese aircraft and their targets. Interceptions became deliberate, not reactive. Tactically, American pilots abandoned turning dogfights, where the Zero excelled, and adopted hit-and-run attacks, high-speed diving passes, short bursts of fire, immediate disengagement. The goal was no longer to outmaneuver the Zero, but to survive it. Aircraft design reinforced this shift. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, though slower and less agile, could absorb punishment. Armor protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of fire. American pilots learned that they could take hits and keep fighting, something Japanese pilots could not rely on. Intelligence played a quiet but decisive role. Captured documents, combat reports, and after-action analysis revealed patterns in Japanese tactics. The myth of invincibility began to erode, replaced by specific counters: climb rates, preferred attack angles, fuel limitations. For Japanese aviators, these changes were not immediately obvious. On patrol, the sky still looked empty. Radios remained quiet, but something had changed in the air itself. Interceptions came sooner. Enemy fighters appeared already above them. Fire came not in swirling dogfights, but in sudden, violent flashes from the sun. The waiting became different. It was no longer the calm before easy dominance. It was the pause before contact, with an enemy that had learned how to strike first, and how to vanish before retaliation. This transformation set the stage for a deeper examination of what Japanese pilots faced. Not just new tactics, but new pressures, human, mechanical, and moral, all converging in the thin air above the Pacific. Inside the cockpit, fear was never acknowledged openly, but it was always present. Japanese naval aviators were raised in a culture that equated emotional control with honor. Training emphasized endurance, obedience, and the suppression of personal doubt. A pilot was expected to fly into combat without hesitation, to trust his aircraft and his training absolutely. Fear, if it existed, was something to be mastered internally, yet waiting tested that discipline more than combat itself. Long patrols over open water left pilots alone with their thoughts. There was no enemy to fight, no immediate task to complete, only the knowledge that an unseen threat could appear at any moment. Many pilots later recalled that the first sight of enemy aircraft brought relief as much as terror. The waiting was over. Japanese patrol doctrine relied on visual detection and formation cohesion. Fighters were spaced for mutual support, scanning the horizon for movement. This system worked when the enemy approached visibly and predictably. Radar changed that equation. Allied fighters could arrive already positioned for attack, diving out of the sun or clouds. The first indication of danger was often tracer fire slicing through the air. In these moments, Japanese formations fragmented instinctively, not from panic, but from survival. The Zero's strengths became liabilities during surprise engagements. Its lack of armor meant that even a short burst of .50 caliber fire could be catastrophic. Fuel tanks ignited, control cables snapped. Pilots learned that the first hit often decided the outcome. This knowledge sharpened fear during the wait. Every minute aloft increased the odds of being surprised. Every patrol carried the possibility that the first sound of combat would also be the last. These pressures did not exist in isolation. They were shaped by command expectations, enemy intent, and an honor code that left little room for retreat, forces that together pushed Japanese pilots toward a breaking point yet to come. Imperial Japanese Navy leadership believed air superiority was a matter of spirit as much as technology. Orders emphasized aggression and initiative, expecting pilots to press attacks even when conditions turned unfavorable. Withdrawal was rarely discussed as a tactical option. Success, commanders believed, would come through resolve and momentum. This philosophy placed immense pressure on pilots during interception patrols. Waiting was not passive. It was an obligation to be ready to attack immediately, regardless of odds. When Allied fighters appeared first and struck hard, pilots faced a dilemma their doctrine had not prepared them for: whether to pursue or survive. American pilots, once outmatched, had learned to exploit Japanese predictability. They avoided prolonged engagements. They attacked in pairs or divisions, focusing fire on single targets. They disengaged quickly, refusing the kind of duel Japanese pilots preferred. From the Japanese cockpit, the enemy felt elusive and unnatural, striking suddenly, then disappearing. There was no decisive turning fight, no clear victory or defeat in the moment, only damage, loss, and uncertainty. Japanese military culture placed honor above survival. Many pilots internalized the belief that death in battle was preferable to failure. But as losses mounted, this ideal collided with reality. Experienced aviators understood that dying accomplished nothing if the mission failed. The waiting before contact became a moral test. Pilots had time to think about their families, their training, and the knowledge that the first hit might come without warning. Courage was no longer about charging the enemy. It was about enduring the anticipation. These tensions could not last indefinitely. Eventually, waiting gave way to impact, not as a single moment, but as a series of encounters that shattered assumptions and forced the air war into a new, irreversible phase. The waiting ended not with a warning, but with impact. In May 1942, during the opening phases of what would become the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese pilots encountered something unfamiliar in the air resistance that arrived first. American carrier-based fighters were no longer reacting to attacks, they were intercepting them. On the morning of May 7, Japanese strike aircraft lifted off from carriers Shikaku and Zuikaku, flying toward reported enemy positions. The pilots expected opposition. What they did not expect was how early it would come. American F-4F Wildcats, guided by radar and coordinated from carriers Lexington and Yorktown, were already climbing into position. The first hit came suddenly, a diving attack out of the sun, tracer rounds ripping through formation. For Japanese pilots, there was no gradual escalation. One moment, clear sky. The next, aircraft exploding midair. The Zero's agility allowed violent evasive maneuvers, but the shock had already taken hold. Pilots broke formation instinctively, engines screaming as they dove or climbed for survival. Radio calls overlapped in clipped urgency. Warnings, sightings, silence where voices had been moments earlier. At Midway a month later, the pattern repeated, with greater consequence. On June 4, 1942, Japanese combat air patrols were drawn down to low altitude by torpedo bomber attacks. When American dive bombers arrived from above, Japanese pilots were out of position. The first hits were not on aircraft, but on carriers. Explosions tore through flight decks. Fuel and munitions ignited. For pilots airborne at the time, the sight below was devastating. The sky they had been trained to dominate now betrayed them. The waiting that followed these moments was different. It was no longer about anticipating contact. It was about realizing that control had been lost, and that the enemy now dictated when and how the first blow would fall. That realization would deepen as surviving pilots were forced back into the air, facing an enemy that had seized momentum and refused to relinquish it. After Coral Sea and Midway, Japanese pilots returned to the air with a knowledge they had never carried before, that survival could no longer be assumed. In the months that followed, particularly over Guadalcanal beginning in August 1942, the waiting became a constant presence. Missions launched from Rabaul or forward airstrips meant hours over open water, fuel calculations precise to the minute. There was no margin for error. If interception came late, pilots might not have enough fuel to return. American fighters, operating from Henderson Field, were waiting too, but with advantages Japanese pilots could not see. Radar tracked incoming raids. Fighter direction officers vectored interceptors to altitude. When contact occurred, it was on American terms. The first hit often decided everything. A burst of fire severed a control line. A fuel tank ignited. A pilot never heard the sound that killed him. Japanese veterans later recalled that fear no longer came from combat itself, but from anticipation. They scanned the sky constantly, necks aching, eyes burning. Clouds became threats. Sunlight became danger. Every moment before contact stretched unbearably long. Losses mounted quickly. Replacement pilots lacked the experience of those they replaced. Training hours were reduced. Formations grew less cohesive. Each mission thinned the ranks of men who truly understood air combat. By late 1942, Japanese air units were no longer hunting. They were reacting. Patrols became defensive. Escorts flew closer, tighter, limiting maneuverability. Aggression gave way to caution, a psychological shift as damaging as any physical loss. The sky had become hostile territory. And when pilots landed, those who returned, they carried with them the weight of what waiting had become. Not preparation for victory, but endurance against inevitability. What followed was not a single defeat, but a long unraveling, measurable in numbers, strategy, and the quiet exhaustion of men who knew the war in the air had turned against them. The consequences of that shift in the air were immediate and relentless. By the end of 1942, Imperial Japanese naval aviation had lost a significant portion of its most experienced pilots. At Midway alone, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, and many of the aircrews assigned to them, men who could not be replaced quickly, or at all. Guadalcanal continued the attrition. Each mission cost aircraft, fuel, and lives at a rate Japan's training system could not sustain. Unlike the United States, Japan lacked a large-scale pilot rotation and replacement program. Veteran pilots remained in combat until they were killed or physically unable to fly. As losses mounted, training hours for new pilots were drastically reduced. The quality gap between early war veterans and late war replacements widened dangerously. Aircraft numbers also declined. Industrial limitations, material shortages, and Allied bombing campaigns slowed production. New models arrived too late, in too few numbers, and often without the performance needed to restore parity. The Zero, once feared, became increasingly vulnerable. Strategically, Japan was forced into a defensive posture across the Pacific. Air power shifted from offensive strikes to the protection of shrinking territories. Long-range patrols continued, but now they were flown with caution rather than confidence. Every takeoff carried the awareness that return was uncertain. Reports from the period reflect a growing fatalism. Pilots noted that missions felt like calculated risks rather than expressions of dominance. The waiting before contact was no longer a temporary tension, it was an accepted condition of flight. Yet even as losses mounted, Japanese leadership struggled to adapt doctrine fully. Honor and aggression remained central themes, even when circumstances demanded conservation. This disconnect accelerated the erosion of air effectiveness and deepened the psychological toll on those still flying. The war in the sky had become one of endurance, and endurance favored the side that could replace men and machines faster than fear could consume them. That imbalance would only grow more pronounced as the conflict stretched into its final years. As 1943 unfolded, the nature of waiting in the cockpit changed once again, from tension to expectation. Japanese pilots now flew knowing that interception was likely, not possible. The enemy would appear. The only uncertainty was when. Patrol routes became predictable. Fuel shortages limited flight time. Aircraft were pushed beyond maintenance schedules. Even before contact, the odds were narrowing. American air power expanded relentlessly. New fighters arrived with superior speed, climb rate, and firepower. The F-6F Hellcat and later the F-4U Corsair were designed with one lesson in mind: survive the first hit and deliver a devastating second. Radar coverage widened, coordination improved. Experience accumulated instead of disappearing. For Japanese pilots, this meant the waiting was no longer about readiness. It was about resignation. Veterans described scanning the sky with the knowledge that escape options were limited. The Zero could still maneuver, but it could not absorb damage. One mistake, one unseen attacker, ended everything. The psychological weight of this reality was immense. Pilots flew missions with reduced expectations of survival. Letters home became more reflective. Training emphasized duty rather than victory. By late war, this mindset would evolve into organized sacrifice, but in these earlier stages, it manifested as quiet endurance. Defensive flying replaced initiative. Japanese formations stayed low or hugged cloud cover. Escorts flew closer, sacrificing flexibility. Every choice was shaped by fear of the unseen first hit. By the time Japan fully lost air superiority, the transformation was complete. The sky was no longer a domain of control. It was a contested, hostile space where survival depended on luck as much as skill. And when pilots waited now, they were not waiting for opportunity, they were waiting for impact. That reality leaves behind more than statistics. It leaves a lesson, one written not only in aircraft wreckage, but in the minds of those who flew knowing the war above them had already turned. In the history of aerial warfare, victories are often measured in aircraft destroyed, territories gained, or enemies forced from the sky. But for the men who flew, the war was felt long before any shots were fired. For Japanese pilots in the Pacific, the most profound change was not defeat itself. It was the moment they realized the waiting had shifted sides. Early in the war, silence in the sky meant control. Later, it meant vulnerability. The empty horizon became a warning rather than a reassurance. Modern air combat had revealed its true nature. Speed and maneuverability alone were not enough. Information, coordination, and endurance mattered more. The side that could see first, strike first, and replace losses would ultimately dominate the air, regardless of individual bravery. The Japanese experience showed how quickly confidence could become exposure, and how doctrine rooted in spirit could falter against systems built for adaptation. Pilots did not lose because they lacked courage. They lost because courage could not compensate for attrition, technology, and time. In the end, the sky did not belong to those who feared least. It belonged to those who learned fastest. And for those Japanese aviators who waited in silence, listening to engines and scanning endless blue, the war was decided in those moments before the first hit, when anticipation weighed heavier than fear, and the future narrowed to a single, fragile second suspended in air.